Hi everyone, welcome back to VCC Talks, the podcast for everything clean transportation. I'm your host, Ella Sher, and I'm back for another episode with today's special guest, University of Virginia law professor Allison Gocke. Allison has been at UVA since 2022, and her research surrounds everything in the realm of energy, administrative, and environmental law. She's made several key publications surrounding the national electricity grid, and as a pre-law student myself, I'm incredibly excited to have you on the show today. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Ella. I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, we're thrilled to have you. And to kick things off, let's go ahead and get into some questions. Since 2022, like I said, you've been a law professor at the University of Virginia. So can you tell us a little bit about your path before arriving in Charlottesville? And secondly, what drew you to the world of energy law?
Yeah. So I have been very lucky to be in Charlottesville for the last couple years. But before that, I was a joint degree student in law school. So I studied both law and environmental science, knowing that I was going to go off into the environmental law world in some way. So after I graduated, I clerked on a federal court and then was thinking about what I wanted to do in the environmental field. So I ended up taking a fellowship. There was a joint fellowship with the Natural Resources Defense Council, which is a big environmental NGO. Some of your listeners may be familiar with it.
Absolutely.
And then also Yale Law School. And the fellowship was sort of structured so that I would go to NRDC for a year and practice environmental law with them. And then I would spend a year with Yale running their environmental law clinic. And so it was a nice way for me to explore both environmental practice and the thing that I had hanging around in the back of my mind, environmental academia, if I was interested in going back into the academic world. And so I got to take advantage of both of those while I was at that fellowship to see where I thought my interests might lie. And I realized while I was there that I really loved academia as much as I enjoyed practice as well. So after that, I did another fellowship at the University of Chicago as a sort of pre-academic market fellowship, and then made my way over to UVA.
That is so neat. So moving on to the next question a little bit, how have the projects that you've worked on throughout your career informed your view on energy policy? And I wrote in the notes that I'm especially curious about your work at NRDC because I know they're spearheading some really cool projects right now.
Yeah, I mean, I started in this being interested in environmental law generally. I was also an environmental science co-major in undergrad. So I knew pretty early on that I was interested in the environment in some way. And I think I also came to focus on climate change in particular pretty early on. So I knew that I wanted to study those areas in some manner, but I didn't really know what I wanted to specialize in. And as I studied more at Stanford, and then particularly when I went to NRDC, I realized that increasingly, if you're interested in climate change and the law today, then you are interested in energy law. And that can be kind of a niche field. It's pretty technical. It feels like it's full of economists and accountants and not really lawyers or people who are interested in sort of environmental change more broadly. But it is incredibly important. And actually, when I first showed up at NRDC, I was working in their climate and clean energy office, and I thought I would do sort of traditional EPA regulatory work while I was there. But I ended up working on their sustainable FERC project and learning more about the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, the major federal agency that's in charge of our energy regulations. And so as I became more aware of what was going on there, I knew more and more that energy law was what I was interested in doing. And I think that my work at NRDC inspired me to look into this agency of FERC and our energy regulations more broadly and what they are, how they're structured, what they were intended to do, and how they are or are not adapting in the face of climate change today.
That's a fantastic answer. Could you speak a little bit more maybe to some of your work with FERC in terms of how that relates to clean transportation?
Yeah, the transportation aspect is interesting. So FERC is the major federal agency that regulates our energy systems, and it implements two statutes primarily, the Federal Power Act and the Natural Gas Act. And those do sort of what their names suggest. So the Federal Power Act involves the regulation of the federal side of our electricity systems and also our hydropower systems and the electricity grid. So if you've heard a lot about grid stuff recently, a lot of that has to do with FERC-related work. And then the Natural Gas Act regulates the other side of that system, which is our natural gas system. So anything related to the federal aspects of our pipeline system and our natural gas industry. So those are two very big remits. There are also a bunch of state-level agencies known as state public utility commissions that are also heavily involved in our energy regulation. And then on the federal level, there are also a bunch of other agencies that are involved in energy regulation. So you can see this gets complicated very quickly. But I'm thinking about sort of transportation in particular. Transportation we usually think of as being under the purview of two other agencies, the Department of Transportation and the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and our laws related to sort of the regulation of vehicle emissions and maybe even clean transportation usually come from those agencies. But if we're looking at a world in which we're trying to address climate change, one of the primary goals is to shift from sort of fossil fuel-based transportation mechanisms to mostly electrified transportation. And when you start talking about electrification, then you are in the world of the electricity grid and the Federal Power Act, and therefore FERC, and also the state public utility commissions that are involved in that. So that gives us sort of a broad overview of kind of the relationship between those. But that means that right now there are a lot of things happening in various places related to transportation. FERC is one piece of that, maybe a smaller piece now, but FERC and the state level agencies in particular will probably be a larger piece as we shift to more and more electrification of our vehicle systems.
That's so interesting, because my next question was sort of in that similar realm. Given your expertise in administrative law, how do you see the role of these federal institutions that you're talking about, like the EPA, like the Department of Energy, and or the Department of Transportation, evolving in the context of clean transportation initiatives?
Yeah, and I do think, they will all continue to play a really important role. So one major piece when we're talking about vehicles, and if we're thinking about cars or light-duty trucks, I'm sure you guys have come across this. A lot of those regulations come out of the Department of Transportation and EPA together. NHTSA's authority to set CAFE standards and EPA's authority to set vehicle emission standards. Those are very important when we think about the array of regulations affecting our vehicle systems, and they will continue to be so. I say all that thinking that I just published an article on the relationship between energy and environmental law and how we have to think more carefully about energy regulation being a really crucial part of all of this. And transportation is an interesting example there. So we are seeing increasing involvement in what we think of as traditional energy regulators, public utility commissions, in vehicle regulation. So if we're thinking about EV storage charging stations, a lot of the activity there is happening within public utility commissions and by utilities. So there are going to be a wide variety of players, as there usually are when we're thinking about the regulatory landscape here. But I do think there's an increasingly prominent role that public utility commissions and utility regulation are playing in some of these. And I think that has both opportunities and, potential pitfalls. And it's important to work through all of those.
Absolutely. I know at least on the Virginia Clean City side of things, we do a lot of work with Dominion Energy and the Rappahannock Energy Co-op. So we work a lot with those utility companies to try to collaboratively assess the need for certain types of alternative fuel energies sources. Yeah. So that portion is really interesting that you mentioned that as well.
Yeah, and it can be both a good thing and a bad thing. I mean, we're thinking that we would have to build out a significant amount of EV charging infrastructure over the next couple decades to support an electrified fleet.
Right.
And so in some ways, maybe it's helpful to have utilities that are involved in providing our electricity, engaging in that project. But there's also a long history of sort of problems with utility regulation. In particular, utilities are monopolies, and controlling those monopolies and making sure that they act in ways that are beneficial not just for themselves but also for the public has been very difficult. And part of the whole idea behind public utility regulation is about how to make that work. And I'm sure we will run into some of those questions as we think about the vehicle context too.
Absolutely. Shifting gears a little bit, what do you think, as a professor, the role of academia and academic institutions, like the ones that you've been involved in the past, is in the world of future environmental and energy policy? Specifically, again, how can this question be extended to the world of clean transportation?
Yeah, I mean, I thought about this a lot, even just when I was thinking about what I wanted to do.
Right.
And I was thinking about sort of the academic path versus the practice path. And I think they're really important things for people to be doing in the world as lawyers, as activists, as whatever sort of position they see themselves in making change in the world. I think the special thing about academia is you get to kind of take a step back and look at the big picture and see what's actually happening on the ground, and also think about maybe what the future could look like, should look like. You get to engage in some really interesting world building projects as an academic. And that has been actually one of the things that I've been thinking about recently. I was just at a conference talking to some other people in law and social science and engineering, and we're all talking about what does it actually mean to decarbonize our energy systems, and what would that world look like? That's a really hard question. It's a really complicated question. And as an academic, you sort of get the benefit of getting to sit back and spend your time thinking about that question. So I think that's the role that academics play, is like really engaging in the difficult but interesting task of both evaluating the world as it is now and thinking about what the world could be or might be in the future. For transportation in particular, that is not necessarily my specialty, so I don't necessarily think about that all the time. But I do think a lot about what our electricity system is going to look like when we start bringing more and more things onto the grid. And I've been puzzling over the idea that over the next couple decades, we're probably going to have significant changes, not just in the grid that we're going to build for the future, but also our existing grid, and trying to make it reliable and affordable and well-functioning for our current needs. And as we add more vehicles to that, that makes that a really complicated question. So that's kind of how I've been thinking about it recently.
That's really interesting in terms of the first part of that, where you were saying professors and academics have this sort of advising role. So in some situations where you guys would work with a lot of these fleet managers or utility companies and say, hey, this is sort of what we're thinking big picture, whereas they're super zoomed in and really focusing on their specific fleet or their specific role in their utility company. So I think that's a really interesting perspective.
Yeah, and I think in some ways also as academics, like you have the freedom of being able to just think on your own. You know, you're not trying to solve a particular problem for one person or working to represent a certain group and you want to make their initiative happen. You get to imagine, like, what would we ideally want and how do we get there and what do I think are the important questions in that? That's the real beauty and sometimes, I think, challenge of academia.
I can definitely relate to that. Energy law and the discipline of law in its entirety can be super intimidating for people looking to include alternative fuels like hydrogen, biofuel, propane, and especially right now, electric vehicles or electric vehicle chargers in their local businesses. At VCC, we do a lot of work providing the people of the Commonwealth with the resources and funding necessary to head these projects at home. And so as a legal expert, what are your best recommendations for breaking down these barriers to make the process more accessible for local institutions that may be struggling? Are there specific legal frameworks or strategies that you know of that could encourage wider adoption across Virginia?
So I think this is a really challenging question, and it is hitting the energy world in a variety of ways. So like one example that immediately comes to mind is if you know anything about the Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of the IRA credits that were created, this was an act that was intended to promote investment in sort of renewable and zero-free energy resources. And the act is structured so that there are a variety of tax credits given to different entities. Some of those tax credits are actually given to communities to try to encourage them to engage in a transition of their energy systems from historically fossil-based systems to more renewable energy-based systems, particularly in energy communities that were reliant historically on coal or natural gas or, a single fossil fuel source that maybe has disappeared. And these benefits are given to communities themselves. So they are sort of tax grants or rebates and sometimes credits. And it relies on communities being able to apply for a grant with the Department of Energy to get money to institute some sort of change on the ground, often in places where there is no infrastructure to support this. No one has any experience engaging in writing sort of grant requests. It's a real challenge, like sort of capacity challenge that we're talking about here. And I think it's true on the vehicle front too. I think we're going to learn some lessons over the next couple of years about how to do that well. I think it always helps to have a civil society organization that has been doing work on that on the ground in the past that can sort of step in and help communities that are interested in engaging. So organizations like yours, or I'm thinking there are some communities in West Virginia that have been working with local community groups that are established there and have some connection to coal redevelopment organizations. I think drawing on those existing resources of nonprofits and NGOs who know how to do this kind of work, that can be really important. And I think having the kind of statewide initiative can help because that can build some capacity that might not exist if you're just looking at a local level. In terms of getting people engaged on the day-to-day, I do think that comes down to community organization, community groups who can help. There can be a lot more work that people like attorneys can do to help people who may not be aware of some of these programs actually navigate them. People who are better at social media and those sorts of things than I am. I know there used to be an energy law TikTok. I don't know if that still exists, but those things that can reach people where they're at and then explain this stuff to them, I think it's really important. And we actually need people who are in, the newer generation growing up who can actually communicate with people easily on some of these.
Absolutely. Community engagement is one of the biggest things that VCC focuses on also.
Yeah.
So it's really cool how you brought that up again. Everything is hitting these check marks.
Yeah. It's funny. It's a lot of this stuff happens at, higher levels, federal level. A lot of the money from the IRA is coming out of the federal government.
Right.
But it has to filter down to the grassroots, and the grassroots are only going to see it and, be able to take advantage of it if you have these kinds of networks of support that happen at the local level. So the local matters a lot here. Yeah.
Absolutely. In terms of a more optimistic sort of question, what are you looking forward to most in terms of changes on the horizon for clean energy? I know you were talking a little bit about really getting young people engaged in social media or different marketing strategies to talk about clean energy, but what are you looking forward to the most?
I have to say, I just had a field trip to a solar plant in Indiana that was so inspiring.
Wow.
I spend a lot of my time thinking about all the challenges that come with this stuff, particularly on the energy side. We've been thinking about our existing transmission system and whether it's adequate to support all these new power plants that are coming online because of the Inflation Reduction Act and other things. And so I think about the problems a lot of the time. But I got to tour a solar facility recently in Indiana and hear about how the group there navigated all of those challenges and successfully have many projects coming online. And I remember just sort of distinctly standing in the middle of the solar field and looking out and thinking, this is a really cool way of creating energy. And it is very different from when I've stood at other places. I've visited coal mines, I've visited other kinds of power plants, and it felt a little bit like standing in the future, like, oh, this is how we're going to produce energy in the future.
Wow.
This is really exciting. So I was inspired just to actually see there is change happening around us all the time. And it is certainly a challenge, and it gets done through the work of people like you and others in the world, but it is actually happening, and that's pretty cool.
That's so neat. We recently had a coworker who took a field trip to West Virginia and took a look at their wind farm that they have there. They have a gigantic wind farm of all these wind turbines, hundreds. He was like, everywhere you could see was just wind turbine. And so the fact that we're on the precipice of all of this cool change is really awesome.
Yeah, it is definitely inspiring. And there are definitely going to be challenges with that too. And you think always about, how is this transition going to happen? Are we going to make sure that it's equitable and affordable for everyone in that process? Those are still really difficult questions, but it was exciting just to see things happening on the ground.
Absolutely. That's a great answer. As we're nearing the end of my questions, I would just first like to say thank you so much for joining me. I really do appreciate the insights that you have are so valuable. And I just wanted to ask my last question, is there anything else you'd like to highlight or mention that we might have missed in this interview conversation?
Well, I will say thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed this, and it's just really exciting for me to even just learn about various things in Virginia that are happening. As I said, I'm only recently a Virginia resident. I moved here 2 years ago, so I'm still learning about Virginia energy and everything that it's doing. So it's great to meet folks who are working in that. Things that are missing. I think that we covered a lot of the pieces of the energy system that I find really interesting. I would just say there's a lot of exciting stuff happening all over in energy and environmental law today. And if that's something that you're interested in doing, I encourage people to go out and find out how they want to get involved. That can mean being an academic like me. That can mean being an activist. That can mean going to work for various companies that are building these new facilities. It's a whole variety of things. But I think there are really smart and thoughtful and exciting people in this field. And I would encourage folks to reach out to them if they have any interest in going into it, because I think it's a really great place to be thinking about what we want the world to look like in the next several decades and hundreds of years.
That was great. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks for listening to the Virginia Clean Cities podcast. I'm your host, Ella Sher, and look out for me on new episodes coming soon.